What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of this week's episode, where we're going to dive into the weeds of what it looks like to prepare for a therapy session. I had made an episode a year or two ago about what it's like in general as a newer therapist versus a more seasoned therapist. And one of the variables that I spoke about was how anxious I used to be earlier on as I prepared for my therapy sessions and over-prepared for my therapy sessions, and now how I feel a lot more comfortable. I spend way less time preparing and definitely way less anxiety preparing for therapy sessions. And in that specific episode, there were a number of comments from folks saying that they resonated with that specific piece of over-preparing, whether you were a new therapist yourself, leaving that comment saying, I relate right now, or more seasoned therapists saying, oh yeah, I remember I used to really be overly anxious preparing for sessions. It feels like it's in that category of like stuff all of us do as a therapist, but like we don't necessarily intentionally talk about very often. So I thought today I'd share a bit of my process of how I used to prepare for sessions, especially earlier on when I was a lot more anxious about like everything. And how things have progressed over time and how I prepare for sessions now. I definitely don't see these as like prescriptive steps, like you should do it the same way as me. It's obviously going to vary depending on the kind of workplace you're in, the type of person you're working with, the type of therapeutic modality, orientation, etc. that you might be utilizing. But I think there's some little takeaways in here that could be relevant to people in different settings, even if it's not like an exact mapping of using the exact same steps to prepare. So it seemed like it could be a good topic to address as a standalone episode. And I am so curious, like, how do you prepare for your sessions? How does it differ from therapist to therapist, different styles, different workplaces, that sort of thing? But today, you're going to get a little insight into how my preparations for sessions have changed over time. If you've been following my stuff for any amount of time, I don't think it's any secret that I can lean anxious in general, and that definitely in my earlier days, I was so anxious. I was so anxious about everything, and preparing for therapy sessions was no exception. Like that was just like prime breeding ground for Marie's anxiety to manifest. So that's the main reason why I want to talk about this today. If you don't have any anxiety around preparing for sessions, then I love that for you. And, you know, some folks listening and watching may have some anxiety around preparing for sessions. So, you know, if that's you, I am speaking to you, and I hope you find this helpful. So before I share more about how I prepare for sessions now, let's take a little walk down memory lane and remember what it looked like for me to prepare for sessions in my early days as a therapist. Certainly when I was still a trainee, pre-licensed, but definitely bleeding into like post-licensure, licensure. Definitely bleeding into post-licensure as well. Giving a window into where we're headed, a huge part of preparing for sessions happens during the session prior and right after the session prior. But as I look back on my earlier days as a therapist, right as I ended a session with a client, I said bye-bye. At that point, I was seeing exclusively in-person clients. So they would walk out the door, I would close the door, and immediately I needed to decompress. Like even if I just had minutes before I needed to see my next client, like I would take that time to zone out. I would check my phone. I would literally stare out the window. I can remember doing that many times out the bay window in my San Francisco office, just imagining myself outside, because our work is hard work. So it may have been an amazing session. It doesn't speak to anything about the client that I was seeing, but more of just like the nature of the work and how exhausting it was, especially early on. Like my brain needed a brief nap before I carried on with my day. And because I had that tendency back then to immediately decompress after sessions for, good reason, I'd be walking away from my notebook and I'd be walking away mentally from my session in order to decompress. So then, even if it was 2 minutes later, if I came back to my notebook and thought to myself, yeah, what did we do today? Like I would just kind of almost be like, I think I already kind of forgot. So that would already make it a little bit more challenging, because then I'd have to spend time, whether it was then or later in the day when I go back to do my notes, to go, what exactly did I do with that client in session? And maybe I'd remember more like how I felt or how I was tired or what it was like for me to be with that client. I'd have a little bit more trouble being like, right, we worked on this treatment goal and we did this intervention and this is a main topic that was coming up for this client. That stuff didn't come as easily, so it was definitely more work right from the gate. And then after the session ended, but before or whenever our next session was, let's say it was in a week, I would have just like a running dialogue of all my different clients and thinking about what I should make sure I'm on top of for our next sessions. Maybe I need to brush up on that certain treatment approach that I haven't utilized in a little while, or maybe I utilize it a lot, like every single week, but I still feel like I need to brush up on it again, just so I make sure I'm on my tip-top game. Or maybe, I'm anticipating like, all right, this client, next time they might bring up, I don't know, what if they brought up this totally new topic? Or what if this, approach that we're taking goes in a totally new direction? And I should be prepared for that just in case. So maybe I would even do things sometimes like sign up for entire CEUs about topics that hadn't even come up yet for my clients, but I would have these like intrusive thoughts almost. Yes, intrusive thoughts that like, uh-oh, this could come up for this client. I could foresee in my crystal ball that this client could be someone who's dealing with, I don't know, I'm just going to make up something, substance use, let's say. And oh gosh, I'm not, extensively trained in substance use. Mind you, they haven't brought up anything about substance use, but my brain just created this story for me to anxiously dwell on. And then I would go, okay, well, just in case they bring up substance use, I better be prepared. Let me just sign up real quick for a CEU that, brings me up to speed on some substance use stuff, gives me a little primer just in case. Just in case. There was a lot of just in case. I should be ready. We don't want to have a situation where I'm caught off guard and I don't know what to do with my client. So I would do what I could to brush up on things, maybe even like try to speed read a whole book between sessions to just kind of make sure I was never caught off guard with something that I wasn't prepared for. That was a huge driver for me for a long time. And then even just thinking about how I would prepare for a day of seeing therapy clients, like not just the specific client, but like I'm going into the office getting ready for work that day, I would come in anxious and I felt like I needed to get there a minimum 45 minutes or an hour early just to reread all of the treatment plans and the prior notes from our prior sessions. My notes were also much longer back then than they are now, so it took more time to read my notes. And I would read both like my process notes and my progress notes, which were both long. So it took me a long time even just to reread and then map out in my mind where I thought we would be going next with our sessions. And then from there, I would try to map out where we would go for the session that day. And now, mind you, most of the time I wouldn't be using a highly structured format. Even within certain structures, there was some flexibility. So it's not like we were moving on to, the next phase of a systematized treatment plan that like this was the exact structure of our session. So I would try to like crystal ball, fortune teller, mind read where we might go for the next session and map it out, which of course, as I say it out loud, obviously doesn't make any sense because I didn't know what direction we would take. And sure enough, more often than not, we'd get into the session and whatever I had mapped out would just get thrown completely out of the window most of the time because something different came up. I didn't know what was going to come up. So it would end up being all this prep work, all this time, all this energy, and then it may not even like offer me any benefit once I actually get to the session. And not to mention on top of all of this, I would go into my sessions like carrying all this muscle tension and I wasn't really living in the present moment. Like it was like, did I remember to think of everything in advance? Am I ready for this? Am I ready for this? Like me. Am I prepared as a therapist? And all of that anxious preparation would leave very little room for me to go, I wonder how my client's doing with that thing. I wonder how they're doing today. I wonder what's going to come out today. I'm curious. I hope they're doing well, right? This like any client focused thoughts that might be relevant to that specific client. I didn't have as much room to just kind of be mindful of that, be present to whatever is about to come up, kind of curiously, like, oh, I wonder what it's going to be like today. Wonder how they're doing. Before I dive into the like very practical step-by-step plan that I personally use to prepare for sessions, I'd like to say like the biggest shift that I've made from my earlier overly anxious days is learning to embrace the space of not knowing. Of course, this is one of those things that has to be held in balance, that obviously I'm not coming in with absolutely no reference for like any therapeutic skills whatsoever. And I just don't know anything at all. I mean, there's a certain sense of confidence of like, I know enough to carry on with wherever we're going. But also I can be very comfortable with the fact that I really don't know everything. In fact, the things I know are pretty limited, but being okay with accepting that there's a whole bunch of stuff that I don't know and letting that just be true has freed me up to be so much more present to my clients, so much more able to be kind of interrupted. Like if we had a path that we were on and I'd prepared to continue with that path, but then something significant popped up in the week since and my client is wanting to talk about that, that doesn't have to feel like a curveball. I can just be grateful that we're here in this moment to then pivot to whatever it is that's coming up. And it's okay that I don't know, and maybe I'm not even familiar with whatever the client might be bringing up that's totally new, and being okay with not knowing. Even if it means coming to the point of acknowledging out loud to my client something like, hey, I'm not really familiar with that, or I don't really know the answer to that. Can I look into that and get back to you next time, or contact you in between and keep you posted? That there is permission to do that if that is the most honest answer that benefits your client. So that, if there's no other takeaway that you have from this episode, and if you need to hear it, like just know it's okay to not know stuff. Like that's totally normal. You can't know everything. You just can't. There's so many things to know that you can't know all of them. And, as you come upon new things, you can inform yourself about them or adapt as you go, but you can't know all of it in advance. It's not humanly possible. All right, so let's get into the practical steps of like how I actually prepare for sessions. And when I sat down to script this episode, at first I thought like, oh, it's those things I do in the minutes leading up to session. But as I got into it, I realized like I start preparing for a session during the session prior. So obviously, if this is like your initial intake assessment, this doesn't apply. But let's say you're on session 5 with somebody, then I'm going to start preparing for session 5 while I'm still in session 4. And even then, it's existing within the arc of whatever the broader treatment plan is, whatever the goals are that we're focusing on. So as I reflect on how I prepare for session, the first step in this example would be during session 4, I would take some notes, just some notes. I used to take a lot of notes, but now I just jot down a few key notes that are primarily focused on the content of what we focused on, as well as a little bit of the process or the dynamics that were coming up for the client, like if there's a theme or something like that. So if let's say I'm working with a client and during session number 4, they spent most of the session grieving the loss of a loved one, then on my notes, I might just say something like grieving the loss of so-and-so. And if applicable, if there's like a quick quote that sort of captures what it feels like for that client or the essence of what we're processing, then I might put a quote. Like maybe if there's a quote that sounds something like, quote, I feel so empty without them here. I might just write that quote, and then that's something that then reminds me like this is what it feels like to be in this client's shoes during session 4. I'm going to remember that as I go into session 5. And of course, during session 4, we were like getting into the weeds, and an earlier version of myself might have like written down all these details of what's in the weeds, but I don't necessarily need to remember all those details for next time. So when I'm taking notes, I'm not thinking about like, let me write down everything that this person's saying or everything that we did. It's more of like, how can I remind myself in the future of like, this was the essence of what we were doing here, so that then later when I sit down to prepare for session 5, or if I'm preparing for session 10 and I'm looking back on my notes from the last 6 sessions, I can go, oh, right, session 4, we focused on their grief of so-and-so. This is how they were feeling in that day and what we focused on. And of course, if we reference any kind of metrics, like let's say they shared their SUD score or something like that, I'll make note of that as well. And I think on reflection, at this point in my career, having a little bit of seasoning under my belt, if you will, I've been a therapist for more than a minute. Now, most of my preparation for a session fully happens during the session prior. That while I'm in that session, a part of me is thinking about what the client is talking about in connection to the broader arc of this is why they're here, this is where they're getting stuck, or this is where they need support, this is how we're working on it. And so I'm already mentally tying it back to the greater arc of our story together and imagining how we might carry this forward while staying present to them in the moment, which I get if you're earlier on. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do all that at the same time early on. And I think that's also a key point to note, is that it takes time to kind of rehearse this enough times that it feels really accessible to kind of toggle both of these things at the same time, to be listening to what they're talking about right now and being in it with them, while also saying like, oh, I just need to note down these 2 things for next time, and that's enough notes for today. But before we get into that, I'd like to thank Powbox for sponsoring today's episode. Based on a poll that I put out last year, only 1/4 of therapists are confident that the email they're using is HIPAA secure. That means that 3 out of 4 therapists listening to this ad right now either aren't using HIPAA secure email or aren't sure if it's HIPAA secure. In 2023, I made the switch to Powbox, and it's been smooth sailing since. Powbox is the simplest, most effective solution for mental health professionals to seamlessly integrate HIPAA security into our email, all while using our favorite email provider. It's just running smoothly and quietly in the background, keeping any potential space invaders from interfering with your emails. If you'd like to check out Powbox for yourself, they're offering Private Practice Skills listeners a special discount. Just use coupon code SKILLS at checkout to get $250 off your first year with Powbox. Thank you again to Powbox for sponsoring this episode, and now back to our conversation. And along the same lines of preparing for a session starting during the session prior, as soon as the session ends with a client, I immediately sit down with my notebook and jot down 1 or 2 notes about whatever interventions we might have utilized and a bullet point of a direction we might take the next time we meet, assuming there isn't something kind of significant that comes up that is worth sort of interrupting the path that we are on. So in the example I referenced, I'm still talking about while preparing for session 5, it's whenever we sign off from session 4 that I immediately jot down these notes so that whenever I show up to the office for session 5, I already have a plan basically right in front of me. This has been such a critical skill that I think took me quite a while to develop. To realize, like, it might sound so simple, but just like immediately just jot down a couple notes, because not only is that going to help me be prepared for the next session, but it's also going to make it way quicker to write my progress note. And also, when I'm thinking of it immediately after the session ends, like not taking any moment of a break, not even 30 seconds of a break to jot it down, it takes me just the shortest amount of time to jot it down. Like, it just flows out of my brain immediately. I don't have to sit and go, wait, what were we talking about again? And I can't remember. Was that last session or 2 sessions ago that we were focusing on that? Like, it's right there. And I just only take like less than a minute jotting it down. And it saves me so much time on so many levels. And I feel like mentally ready already for our next session. Or it flags, like if we said we were going to circle back to such and such, and that's touching on some area that maybe is a little bit less familiar to me, I'm going to make note that that's something I need to brush up on or seek consultation on, or whatever it might be. I need to follow up on this before my next session. So anything that needs to be flagged will have gotten caught in this moment of like, oh yeah, Marie, you kind of need to follow up on this. And if nothing got flagged, then I don't really need to think about that client between sessions. No. So, and that sounded like it could be mean, but like, I don't need to spend all this anxious energy thinking about it. Like, I'm already ready for next time. I will see these notes when I get ready for session number 5, and I'll be on my merry little way for now. I'm all done. So that leads to the next step, where if something did get flagged during the end of me jotting down my little notes during the end of the prior session, then between sessions, I can follow up on anything that got flagged. If there's like a new presenting issue or a question diagnostically, then I need to circle back to, what are the diagnostic criteria of that thing? Or maybe we're touching on a theoretical approach that I haven't utilized in a little while. Let me go circle back to that and brush up on it. Maybe I need some clarification or support, or maybe I'm feeling like I'm dealing with something that came up for me between, because of that session. Let me circle back to some colleagues or supervision or wherever to make sure I get whatever I need to address the flags that came up that I jotted down at the end of our session. And if there aren't any flags, then I don't need to do anything about that client between sessions. I can just carry on, focus on other things, whatever other things are more important right now. And then moving towards, the time actually before our next session, the next step for me in preparing for the session does involve showing up early for the session, but really to focus on more kind of self-care and mental preparation. Now, the idea of showing up with plenty of time to spare is something that's stayed consistent for me over time, but in my earlier years, when I was feeling more anxious, I would show up early to anxiously focus on like clinically related things, make sure I'm totally prepared for all of my clients. And now it looks a lot more like, okay, I'm taking off my mom hat. I'm entering my clean office space, which cannot always be said about my home space. Maybe I'll make myself a cup of coffee. I usually put my makeup on in the office. It's sort of like more time that I can spend in my office, the more kind of transition runway I have to exit kind of the busy chaos of like the rest of my life and enter into this space that I'm about to share with my clients. It kind of feels a little bit similar to like if you have somebody coming over to visit your home, you might spend a bit of time tidying up, but it feels like I'm doing it mentally. Like I'm just letting go of all the messes that might be taking up space in my brain and recentering. And if I'm having a really bad day or an off season or whatever is going on, I will try to lean into that, double down on the self-care pieces, like anything that helps me relax. If I can spend more time in the office, I will prioritize that. Now, of course, I work in an office separate from my home, but I think if I were seeing clients virtually from home, I would love to have a really similar routine of like how I create some kind of boundary or separation between myself and my children or my life as a mom and all of that stuff. I've made some videos before about kind of creating this sacred space before sessions, so I will link to some of those below. Then at this point, once I'm sufficiently like recentered, my mind has slowed down, I've exited whatever the worries of the day are or the hustles of the day are, and then I make sure I'm fed and hydrated and, let's be honest, caffeinated. Then I set aside 5 minutes of final prep before my session and then an additional 5 minutes per client that I'm about to see. So in other words, if let's say I have a client coming in at 9 a.m., then I put a 5-minute buffer before 9 a.m. So now we're at 8:55. And if let's say I'm about to see 3 clients, then I will tag on, an additional 15 minutes before that to prep for each of those clients, which is a really conservative amount of prep time. So then at 8:40, I'd make sure I'm sitting down to do my clinical prep work for my 3 clients that are coming in starting at 9. And for this clinical prep work, it's usually pretty minimal. Like usually I will just reopen my process notes. I don't even open the progress note. I just reopen my process notes and reread those bullet points that I wrote at the end of the last session. And then, of course, if I needed to do any kind of follow-up based on those notes, I would have taken notes about that as well. And I'll just remind myself about whatever that follow-up is. And then getting into like the very, very practical, like nitty-gritty of Marie's personal process, like I will open up a notebook page for each therapy session. Those are my personal process notes. And at the top of the notebook page for each session, I put whatever relevant admin items apply. And of course, the time and date of the session, any amount of fee or charge that I need to charge this client. If they have an outstanding balance, I'll note that there as well. And if they already have their next session after this one scheduled, I will make note of when that is, so I don't have to pull out the calendar to just verbally remind them. And then underneath that little admin section, I will jot down like 1 or 2 lines in reference to whatever I jotted down last time in our session. Often it's almost verbatim copy and pasted. And that really just acts as a reminder to me, like if I do have a bunch of clients back to back, I can quickly, like in 30 seconds, just reread that right at the top of the page. Or if I truly get like lost at some point in the session, I'm thinking, what were we focused on? It's just right there at the top. Here's where we left off and where we're headed. And so it's a shorthand for me to just kind of be reminded of what we're doing and what we had planned on doing next. Now, this whole process of prepping that notebook page usually honestly takes me closer to like 2 minutes rather than 5 minutes per client. But some clients I might say like, oh, right, let me go back to 2 sessions ago or 3 sessions ago. Let me go back a little bit further and remind myself of the broader arc of where we're headed, where we left off. And when I do that, I'm still usually just reading those quick process notes right at the end of the notebook page from the last several sessions, just so I can kind of remember the broader arc of whatever we're focusing on. So realistically, I usually still have extra time available at this point because I've allotted 5 minutes to prep for each session when I probably only needed 2 or 3 minutes. But I definitely make sure there's at least 5 minutes remaining before the session starts to just do kind of logistical tidy ups. Like literally, if there's any clutter around, then I tidy it up. But things like, making sure my phone is set to do not disturb and it's on silent and I have it face down, whether I'm meeting virtually or in person. That's always how I approach it. And if I'm meeting virtually, I make sure I have the appropriate windows open on my screen. It's usually like my schedule and my secure online video platform. And it'll always have the internet speed test window open as well. So if we have any technological issues, that's ready to go. We're getting into the nitty-gritty details here. And I close all other tabs, all other windows on my computer so I don't have any distractions. Or if I'm seeing clients in person, then I make sure I have my little side table next to my chair set up with my notebook and anything else that I need logistically for sessions, so that last 5 minutes, like I can just make sure everything's really set to go and I'm not caught off guard by any of this stuff at the start of the hour. And then, of course, I make sure I have time to use the restroom. And that's an important part of my preparation. And that about sums up how I prepare for sessions. At this point, the session starts, and I do have an episode all about kind of those first few minutes of the therapy session. So if that's something you'd like to kind of continue on into, I'll link to that episode below. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, this is just how I go about things, how I've shifted my preparations for sessions over time in a way that fits me, the solo private practice that I work in, the types of presenting issues that I work with, and that sort of thing. It's going to look different from place to place. But one thing I'll say that has been really helpful, in addition to, accepting the not knowing and being able to say, I don't know if I don't know something with a client, is that I've de-emphasized like the pressure that I used to put on myself, that for my clients to have some like epic aha moment or breakthrough moment every single session. Because that's not, there are some clients that are just like primed and ready for that, and that can kind of happen, but I wouldn't say that's the norm. I would not say that every session tends to have a big breakthrough. Sometimes we have the breakthrough, but I don't think that that's the goal. I think that creates an unrealistic, unnecessary pressure. And I also think that like real progress and real change doesn't tend to come from a series of like epic breakthroughs. There may be a sprinkling of breakthroughs here and there, but most progress comes from these like slight little adjustments and then rehearsing a new way of thinking over and over again, or looking at something from a different perspective, just a little bit different this time than we did last time, and making these sort of more marginal, small shifts, almost unnoticeable shifts. But then if you look at the arc of treatment over time, over, let's say, the last 5 sessions, have we seen some shifts in this person's perspective? Or over the arc of our work together, can we see them progressing towards their treatment goals? And so I have really shifted my focus on, is the average progression of our treatment moving towards their treatment goals? Of course, if it's not, then we should make adjustments and all of that. But I try to de-emphasize the urgency, the pressure to say like, this session needs to be amazing. And it's sort of like, this session needs to continue on the path that we've been on. which sometimes just feels like putting one foot in front of the other and continuing to move forward. So again, I know that this just reflects my own little world, my own little bubble, how I do therapy in my context. And so I'm really curious what sorts of tips you've found useful as you've kind of honed in on your system for seeing clients. Like, how do you prepare for your sessions? What are some of the things that you found really helpful? And feel free to leave them in the comments below, because I always love when you all share your tips, because I'm just me. And it's helpful to hear from all of you as well. Well, thanks for joining me in this episode. I hope it was helpful. Sometimes the things that I'm curious about, I'm like, does this matter? These are things that I think about, though. So hopefully some of you are interested and you can get your juices flowing, right? What are the things that help you prepare for session? Is there anything that's working well for you, or is there anything that you'd like to try a little bit differently to make it easier for you and your clients? Ultimately, it's going to help you and your clients. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.